we're going to have a shorter coffee break so that we have to finish at 5 when the IT people go home. So let me just start by introducing the next speaker. He's Hillel Aharoni, and I'm sure I didn't say it right. And he's going to talk to us about making faces. And he's from Israel. Weizmann is behind him.
All right, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry. I kind of lost my voice. I hope everything goes well. I'm Hillel from the Weizmann Institute in Israel. And I'm going to talk about this project, which is kind of ongoing for me, and different aspects of it were done with different collaborators from the Hebrew University and Penn and the Weizmann Institute. Well, you can see the people who were involved. Two of them are here. Randy, as you may have noticed, is here. And Itai Grignasti, which is also sitting over there. He's presenting a poster in the poster session later, and all of the, I guess, newest developments on this he can talk about. So the motivation for what I'm about to present is programmable design. How do we take a shape and program it into a material such that when we choose to switch some external field, the material will take the shape that we want it to make. So we don't want to design materials, you know, with some machine. We want the shape to be programmed into the material itself. And these are two examples. This is self-folding origami, where you shine light on a piece of origami and certain lines are programmed to fold upon this lighting. These are hydrogels, where by heating the bath, different parts contract by different amounts, and the flat sheet takes a new shape of a saddle in this case. And one can really program many types of shapes into the material by controlling some local degree of freedom in the material that is coupled to the external field. And the motivation here is to being able to create many types of shapes, being able to program many types of shapes, and also being able to take a shape that we want to make and find out how to program it into a material. And nematic elastomers are, in many aspects, materials that are very suitable for this task. So these are elastomers, so cross-linked polymer chains with nematic order embedded into them. And the nematic order is coupled to the mechanical deformation, and upon some actuation field, it can be temperature or light or other things, the liquid crystal tends to lose the nematic order, and the material shrinks along the director and expands in the perpendicular directions, or the other way around. And from the early 90s, people are making these materials, and even starting earlier, developing theories for them. And these materials show very large deformations by a factor of 3 or 4. They are strong, they are able to perform work, they respond quickly, typically within tens of milliseconds. They interact with a variety of external fields, as I said, temperature, light, chemistry, and so on. But also, when I talk about nematic elastomers, I don't strictly speak about nematic elastomers, but about any material which has these properties of anisotropic deformation coupled to an external field. So examples are abundant both in nature and in man-made systems. So here there is a seed pod where the arrangement of cells on the inner layer and the outer layer of the pod, causes the entire pod to twist when it dehydrates because of the different shrinking ratios in the different directions. Even at the level of an individual plant cells, in many plants, the arrangement of cellulose fibrils on the cell wall may cause the individual cells to twist or curl or bend when dehydrated. This is 4D printing. You may have seen this paper. So it's actually 3D printing with materials that, again, would shrink or expand differentially along the direction of the printing fibers or in the perpendicular directions. And again, this can take all kinds of shapes when you heat the water bath that it's in. And these are baromorphs in a recent paper, so there are air tunnels inside this rubber, and when you pressurize or depressurize these tunnels, the shape would change. Now in all of these examples and in nematic elastomers, the actual nematic elastomers, you have a material that at every point has a direction embedded into it. So this is the nematic director. It's not a polar direction, it's a line direction. And this is, as I said, coupled to the deformation, mechanical deformation or strain of the material. So once the external field is turned on, the material would shrink by some factor along the director and extend in the perpendicular directions by a different factor. So we name these lambda 1 and lambda 2. And again, once this modeling was done for each of those systems, the rest is exactly the same. So we don't really care if we talk about nematic elastomers per se or about you know, plant issues or any of the other systems that I talked about. Now, what happens if you take an extended sheet made of such material and you allow the director field to vary from place to place across the sheet? Well, first of all, I'm only talking about planar director fields, not director fields that turn away from the plane. This is mainly because of, let's say, experimental realization reasons. So when you take such an extended sheet and it has some angle of the director field theta within the plane, then once this is actuated and each bit here contracts by a factor of lambda 1 along the director and by a factor of lambda 2 in the perpendicular direction, the entire sheet takes a new geometry. You can explicitly write the post-actuation metric tensor. It looks like an expansion by factors of lambda 1 and lambda 2 rotated with respect to your global Cartesian coordinates by some amount. And you can take this metric tensor and directly calculate its Gaussian curvature, for example, which is an invariant of the two-dimensional metric, and find that it's indeed non-zero. So basically, the new geometry of such a sheet can only be embedded in the space if it buckles out of the plane and makes some shape. And in this talk, I focus on the inverse problem. So basically, how do we take a certain target geometry that we want to make, or a certain distribution of Gaussian curvature that we want to produce, and find a director field in the plane that, before actuation, is just a planar patch with a direction embedded in every position, but after each element here is shrunk by a factor of lambda 1 along the direction and by a factor of lambda 2 the perpendicular direction, takes our target geometry. Okay, generally any generic geometry. So for the rest of this talk, I will focus on this inverse problem. And first of all, I'll start by casting it as in the language of a coordinate transformation. We try to transfer from one set of coordinates to a different set of coordinates which has certain properties. I will then show you solutions for certain simple symmetric cases. Okay, so not this face, but a sphere or a vase or a donut or things like that. I'll show you how we can analytically find the director fields that will fall into those shapes. I will then present a numerical approach that gives us approximate global solutions for the problem, so we can take such a face and find a director field in the plane that, upon actuation, will approximately give us our target geometry, and we can find it numerically. I will then present the newest, still unpublished contribution, an analytical approach to find exact solutions, at least local solutions. So starting at some initial condition, we grow an exact solution. Some of them may we may be able to extend to the entire sheet. Some will remain local. But this gives us not only exact solutions to the target geometry, it gives us all of them, basically, or at least all of them locally. And I will then show an experimental realization of these results that allows us to make an experiment a sheet that will fold into the shape of the face, and I will discuss how to make better faces and optimal faces in some sense. Okay, so the problem of the inverse problem is actually, in a way, a mapmaker's problem. So the mapmaker's problem, or the mapmaker's dilemma, if you want to create a flat map of a curved surface, let's say the Earth, then the map must be distorted, right? Because the sphere has Gaussian curvature, which is non-zero. The flat space has Gaussian curvature, which is 0. So the two-dimensional geometries of those two shapes are different. That's why you must distort the map somehow. Now, some map makers would choose to preserve areas but get the preserve angles but get the areas all wrong. Okay, so the sizes of countries here are wrong, but their shapes are more or less correct. Some other map makers would choose to make areas which get all the areas right, but the angles are all wrong and things are stretched in certain ways. And the inverse problem for nematic elastomers is about making maps which everywhere have both constant area and constant eccentricity. So again, all of these small red circles are identical circles on the sphere. And what we look for is a map that would distort all of these small circles into identical ellipses, where only the direction of the ellipse changes, but the two principal axes are lambda 1 and lambda 2 everywhere. And such a map would actually be, if you make a nematic elastomer with a director pointed along these principal directions everywhere, then upon actuation, it will deform into our target geometry. Now, of course, solving the inverse problem is not about solving spheres, it's about solving any surface, being able to draw such a map for any surface that we want. So, okay, why am I talking about coordinate reparametrization? So when I'm given a target geometry that I want to reproduce, typically it's given in some coordinates. Okay, let's call them psi and eta. These are completely arbitrary coordinates. And in those coordinates, I'm given a two-dimensional metric tensor, which tells me what exactly is the geometry that I'm trying to make in these coordinates. And what I'm looking for is a transformation from those coordinates to my lab table coordinates, the Cartesian coordinates of the table on which I'm actually going to make the nematic elastomer eventually. In those coordinates, as I said before, the metric tensor should look like this. And now how to transform a metric tensor from one set of coordinates to another is quite well known. So I want to find a transformation which takes me to a new metric tensor which everywhere looks like this. So my target geometry for some field theta of x and y. And solving this coordinate transformation problem will also give me theta. It will give me both a domain in the plane and some field theta. That is the director field at every point that is needed in order to make this target geometry. Now, okay, so yeah, I also get a director field. Now let's see examples of this, more visual examples. So again, I'm talking about symmetric cases, in this case, surfaces of revolution. So let's say we want to make this sphere, okay, or any other surface of revolution, like a vase or whatever you want. So such a shape would be given, it could be given in a conformal form. So the metric tensor would look like this, where the factor only depends on one of the coordinates. And what we showed in this case, you can find a coordinate transformation to a new coordinate x by solving this integral equation, and finding a director field as a function of x, and eventually make a ribbon with a director field that only depends on this coordinate x, on the width of the ribbon. So making a nematic elastomer sheet with this director field, upon actuation, will deform into the sphere. In order to see this, I drew tiny circles on my ribbon, and I put it here in the shape of the cylinder, right? This doesn't take any deformation. You can easily deform a flat piece of paper into a cylinder. But now imagine that, this is inside some temperature bath, and once I raise the temperature, every circle here deformed into an ellipse. they all deform into the same ellipse with factors lambda 1 and lambda 2. However, the direction depends on my director field. So circles in the center would deform into horizontal ellipses. Circles on the sides would deform to vertical ellipses. Everywhere it would be along this director field. And once all of this happens at the same time, my flat geometry becomes the geometry of a sphere, which is what I was trying to make. And you can run this exact same algorithm for any surface of revolution. You just need to write down the function, the conformal factor that defines the geometry, and plug it into our equations, and get a ribbon that would deform into that geometry upon actuation. But again, we're trying to make more complicated shapes. So the full inverse problem doesn't involve only surfaces of revolution. It involves making a face. And so a numerical approach that we took to solve this inverse problem, at least approximately, in this paper 2018, is so we start with our target geometry given in the form of a triangulated mesh. Okay, so we have a triangulated mesh embedded in 3 dimensions, which is defines, the target shape that we want to make, or the target geometry that we want to make. And we start with some, again, arbitrary initial parameterization, coordinate parameterization of that surface. So we also have these triangles lying on the plane. Of course, the triangle in the plane is not identical to the triangle on the surface. It is deformed because these are just arbitrary coordinates of the surface. If I was to tile the plane with tiny circles, then these circles would be deformed on the surface. Some of them would be more elliptical or less elliptical, bigger, smaller in different directions. And this is not what I want. This is just the arbitrary coordinates that I started with. But now I can take this triangulation. I can focus again on a single triangle as it appears on the coordinate plane and as it appears on the surface. And there is some linear transformation which takes the triangles from the plane to the surface while deforming it. And I can take this linear transformation and decompose it into a rotation within the plane, followed by stretching along the principal directions of the plane, followed by a rotation in 3 dimensions onto the correct orientation on the surface. So this is actually the singular value decomposition for those who know. Now the rotations, both the first and the last rotations, they do not deform the triangle in any way. It's only this deformation that actually changes the shape of the triangle. And my question is whether these principal deformation values, which again are given uniquely by the singular value decomposition, whether they are lambda 1 and lambda 2 for every triangle. And the answer is, of course, no, because this is a completely arbitrary coordinate parameterization, so the answer would be no. But then there is an algorithm that's taken from algorithms in computer graphics for making this better, okay? So it's composed of a local step of making a small linear calculation at each and every triangle, followed by solving this big linear set of equations on the positions of all the vertices. But it's 2 linear steps which basically make these principal values closer to lambda 1 and lambda 2 on average. So after making this step, I get a new coordinate parameterization which is better than the previous one in the sense that the principal values are closer to lambda 1 and lambda 2 everywhere. And I can continue this process, okay, until it converges. It converges onto a parameterization of my surface, coordinate parameterization, where making these local steps no longer make the principal values closer to lambda 1, lambda 2, and then I can check whether or not they are indeed very close to lambda 1, lambda 2 everywhere, or namely whether the process converges to the global minimum or to some stuck at some local state. But generally, when we took geometries like this face or similar things and start with an initial condition which is good enough for the coordinates, we end up with coordinate parameterization which indeed has the right eigenvalues everywhere. This means that in order that the deformation that takes this coordinate patch onto this surface deforms each and every triangle by factors of lambda 1 and lambda 2 along some direction. Namely, if I now tile the plane again with tiny circles, they all become identical ellipses on the surface with principal values lambda 1 and lambda 2. So this gives me an approximate global solution. Now, this work is good, but we can ask ourselves, okay, if I start with a different initial condition, I now get I end up with a different domain of coordinates and different director field. And these two different director fields would, in principle, fold into more or less the same geometry. But first of all, do they indeed fold into the exact same geometry? Are they really close to an exact solution in a sense? Also, how can I map all of the different director fields that will fold onto the same target geometry? And for this, Itai came up with an analytical approach. So again, we have these two coordinate sets. We have these arbitrary coordinates that we start with, and we have these lab table coordinates which we want to end up with the coordinates in which we actually make the eventual nematic elastomer sheet. And as I said before, if we do that, if we find that mapping, we will have also a director field on the target surface, pointing at every point in some direction, and we can represent the director field by drawing its integral lines and the integral lines that are perpendicular to the director of every point. So the blue lines here are tangent to the director at every point, and the pink lines are perpendicular to the director at every point. Of course, if we do have this mapping, we can also pull these back to the original coordinates or to any other coordinate system that we want. Now, the analytical approach is based on using a third coordinate system, which, not surprisingly, is exactly the coordinate system given by those integral lines. So the coordinate systems in which this grid is just a square grid. Okay? So this new coordinate system is just everywhere parallel and perpendicular to the director field. Now, obviously, right, if you can see distances in the plane here, and you can see that not all blue segments are the same length as they are here. This means that there is the metric tensor written in this new coordinate, the UV coordinate, is not just the unity or something. Length, we get length wrong, basically. So if we write the metric tensor in terms of the U and V coordinates, these coordinates that are parallel and perpendicular to the director at every point, there are scale factors that relate a small change in the coordinate U or the coordinate V to actual length on whatever geometry that we are making. Now, if this could be thought of as the metric tensor, for example, of the plane, again, the metric tensor of the lab table that we're making, we have some factors alpha and beta which relate the changes in U of V to this metric. And what happens when we actuate the sheet is that at every point the material shrinks by a factor of lambda 1 along the direction U and by a factor of lambda 2 along the direction V. So this just involves taking the exact same functional form for the metric and replacing alpha with lambda 1 alpha and beta with lambda 1 beta. Sorry, lambda 2 beta. So in a sense, the metric before actuation and after actuation take very similar forms, which will make everything simple in the future. There is no need to locally rotate things. Things are already oriented the correct way, or the most convenient way. And as I will show you next, using this third coordinate system, we're able to write down all the equations for the inverse problem and integrate them. And then we will also get the equations connecting these coordinates both to our original coordinate system and to our lab table coordinates that we're trying to find. And this will basically give us everything, and will will be able to write down explicitly our director field. So if I have a director field on a two-dimensional surface, it is, or changes or the gradients of this director field can be expressed through its bend and its splay, right? The bend would tell me how much the director field changes as I move along it, and the splay would tell me how much it changes as I move perpendicular to it. So these are the bend and splay, and I can write them down for any director field on any two-dimensional surface. There are no, twist or other terms because I'm only talking about 2 dimensions. But the same bend and splay also tell me about the change in the scale factor that I mentioned, alpha and beta. So the splay would tell me how much the scale factor beta that tells me the actual length as I move a unit along direction v, how much they change as I move along the director. And the bend would tell me about the change of the scale factor alpha as I move along v. So this bend and splay tell me both how the director change, but also how the scale factors change in certain directions. So if I want to now solve for alpha and beta in these new coordinates, I would need to know the bend and splay everywhere. But I, of course, don't know the bend and splay everywhere because I don't know my director field yet. It's part of the problem. So I need some equations to tell me how the bend and the splay change as I change the coordinates. And this I don't have. What I do have is a compatibility condition. So this expression in terms of the bend and splay must equal to the Gaussian curvature of the manifold on which the director field exists. So this is basically the Gauss-Bonnet equation put in different terms. It tells me that the bend and splay should change in a certain correlated way for a director field to actually sit on a certain surface with certain Gaussian curvature. Now, this equation tells me only that some combination of the bend and splay should be equal to the Gaussian curvature, but it doesn't give me explicitly the evolution of either the bend or the splay. But the trick here now is not only that I have all of these coordinate systems, I also have 2 geometries. I have the pre-actuation geometry, which is flat. I have the post-actuation geometry, who has a certain distribution of Gaussian curvature. So I can apply all of these equations both to the flat geometry and to the curved geometry. The flat geometry and the curved geometry are written in the u and v coordinates in almost the same way. The only difference is that the scale factors are different by factors of lambda 1 and lambda 2 everywhere. So if I write this equation for the flat geometry, I can now multiply my alpha by a factor of lambda 1, my beta by a factor of lambda 2. The bend and splay change accordingly. And the new expression would need to equal my target geometry. So I have these 2 equations, one for the curved geometry, one for the flat geometry. And as it turns out, everything breaks out really nicely. So from these 2 equations, I can isolate an equation for the green term and a different equation for the purple term, so that I know the evolution of the splay along the coordinate u and the evolution of the bend along the coordinate v. So basically, if I have all of these variables, the bend and the splay and the alpha and beta, I have for each of them an equation telling me how they should be propagated along some direction, either along u or along v. So what I end up with is a hyperbolic set of partial differential equations. It's already broken to first order equations. With u and v, these integral lines of the director and the integral lines perpendicular to the director being the characteristic curves of this hyperbolic set of PDEs. My parameter, the splay and my parameter scale factor beta propagate along the characteristic u. B and alpha propagate along the characteristic v. And the director itself and the x and y coordinates in the terms of u and v and the psi and eta coordinates in terms of u and v, they're all inherited. I can propagate them as I solve for b, s, alpha, and beta. So basically, we have a mechanism for propagating all of my variables away from an initial condition. Now, an initial condition cannot be anything. It has to be a proper initial condition for, you know, a hyperbolic set of PDEs. Namely, it could be a Cauchy condition. So I can take my target geometry, a face. I can take a curve on this face and decide that the director field along this curve should be something. I just need to make sure it's not a characteristic line. So the director field has to be non-parallel nor perpendicular to the director at any point. And I also need to say what the gradient of the director field is, or the bend, or the splay. And then from this curve, I can start growing a solution to the inverse problem. So I directly integrate the solution to the inverse problem. I no longer have to extract it implicitly from some set of equations. I can explicitly integrate it from my Cauchy initial condition. A second type of initial condition that we use in our preprint is known as a Gorsuch initial condition. So basically, the initial condition is given along characteristics. So half the information is given along one characteristic curve, another is given along second characteristic curve. And I guess the easiest setup for this is to take two curves on my target geometry. So again, any two curves on the face that are orthogonal at the point, or orthogonal at the point where they meet, and decide that I want the blue curve to be parallel to the director everywhere, and that the red curve should be perpendicular to the director everywhere. And given this initial condition, I can start integrating a director field from this initial condition, hopefully cover eventually the entire geometry, but at least initially I will get some X-shaped X-shaped solution, right, that will locally cover a finite environment of my initial condition. And by changing my my initial condition, by deciding on a different curve, or if I set up a Cauchy problem by deciding on a different director along this curve, I can browse through all of these local solutions. So I can, in a Cauchy problem and also in a Gorsuch problem, a certain initial conditions, for a certain initial condition, there exists a unique solution. Again, at least at the local environment, at finite environment. So by setting up a different initial condition along the same curve or along a different curve, I can go through all of my local solutions. And okay, let me now show an experimental realization of this that is actually based on my on the numerical solutions that I showed you before. So basically, this was done by Shu Yang and Yushia, her postdoc in Penn. So basically, they create two molds, and and they coat them with epoxy, and they scorch micronic tunnels on the epoxy, and the liquid crystal molecules would align along these tunnels. And once you put in all the ingredients for the Nematic Elastomer sheet between these two molds, and you cross-link everything, and you take it out of the mold, you get a flat sheet that has at every point a director field pointed the way that we wanted it to point. And I can, I can give them a certain director field, and they make such a Nematic Elastomer. Based on this design, they can do it very accurately. It's also worth mentioning that other groups did other experimental realizations. So Tim White's group in the Air Force labs, and and others also had experimental realizations slightly different but are the same. Also, again, with 4D printing, there are other types of realizations of this. But this way, we get very accurate embedding of our director fields into the Nematic Elastomer sheet. This is the Nematic Elastomer sheet viewed between cross polarizers, so you can actually see what is the planar director at every point. and see whether or not we get what we wanted to embed into it. And this basically is a flat piece of rubber, okay, that is programmed to become, in this case, a saddle when it's heated up, when it's put on a hot plate. And it does, okay? On the hot plate, it becomes a saddle. This is actually a video. Let me run it. It dances a little bit because the hot plate is hotter than the outside environment. The temperature is not completely even. As you pick it up away from the hot plate, it's completely flat, okay? As it was when we made it. Back on the hot plate, it goes back to being a saddle. And we can do it, so this video here shows a dome. Again, away from the hot plate, it's flat. On the hot plate, it becomes spherical. This is the shape of a leaf. You can see in the video it slowly heats up as the hot plate is being heated to take the shape of a leaf. And there is a variety of things we can make. And as you can see here, I am only showing you relatively simple geometries, right? I'm not showing you a face. This is because in order to make a face, it turns out that it's not enough to dictate the two-dimensional geometry into the material. This is because, you know, if I'm trying to make a spherical cap, then as far as the two-dimensional geometry is concerned, the spherical cap is completely identical to the inverted spherical cap, right? Like a dome and a bowl. They have exactly the same 2D geometry. And in fact, if I'm trying to, if I'm trying to make a spherical dome, I don't really care which I get, the one buckled up or the one buckled down. If I'm trying to make a face, then, you know, if my eyes pop out or my nose pops in, that looks nothing like a face, okay? And there are many other isometric embeddings and all kinds of other problems. So in order to robustly make a shape and not just a two-dimensional geometry, as you saw, I guess, 20 seconds ago, I want to also induce reference curvature. And the way to do it is to still have planar director field, but have it twist a little bit from the top and across the thickness of the sheet, from top to bottom. So this is actually the exact same mechanism used by the seed pod to twist. The arrangement on the outside of the pod and the inside of the pod is not the same, the arrangement of cells. This is why the pod curves and twists. So we can use the exact same mechanism to create extrinsic curvatures on the sheet. This breaks the up-down symmetry and allows extrinsic curvatures. And I can directly calculate, given the amount of twist that I put at every point, I can directly calculate the induced reference curvature. And I can go the other way and solve for the twist field at every point. That gives me, in a sense, the best reference curvature that I can put. So I can't make, so the twist field is only 1 degree of freedom. I can't make any reference curvature that I want. Namely, I can only make small saddles. But I can choose the magnitude of these saddles at every point. But this is enough exactly to take any bump and tell the area around the bump or around the nose here that I want it to buckle one way or not the other. So this, in fact, helped us create the actual face. So again, we start with the target geometry. We calculate a numerical solution for a planar director field. We then calculate the best twist field to put at every point. So we end up with 2 molds, one for the top half of the mold, one for the bottom half of the mold. We make the nematic elastomer between them, and we get, so this is not the face yet, this is still when the hot plate is cold. But as the hot plate heats up, you can see the nose popping up, the eyes popping in, you know, the cheeks, everything, and we get a nematic elastomer sheet that transforms into a face. Can't say it's perfectly the face we want to make, but it's similar. Now, as I mentioned before, our analytical approach gives us a way to browse through all the director fields that would deform into a certain geometry. So in the face realization, I started with some initial coordinate parameterization and ended up with a director field. It gave me more or less the face. Again, the reason that it didn't is all the bending energy cost. But if I can, our analytical approach gives us a knob that we can change in order to get a different director field. So basically, all of these director fields at the bottom fold into the same spherical cap, but they are different from each other. And on each of them, I can have certain twist fields, let's say, on top of them. So basically, by browsing through different solutions of my inverse problem, different director fields that fold into the same geometry, I can find the optimal director fields in some sense. So I can find, first of all, fields that will cover the entire geometry and not just a local patch. I can minimize the residual bending energy or the residual bending cost, or get my twist field to better mimic the target curvature. I can also minimize the bend or the splay of the sheets that I end up with. I can control the optical behavior, control the initial buckling, and so on. I can optimize over certain things as I now have a way to browse through all the solutions to the inverse problem. And with this, I'll end because I'm out of time. I'll thank again everyone, the funders, and thank you for listening. Oh, I'm sorry, and also go to Itai's poster session later this afternoon.
Yes, we started a bit late, and now we've over the 40 minutes, so I really asked Carl Lewis, I don't know where he is.
Yeah.
Okay, so if anyone has a question, very quick while we change the speakers, otherwise we will have no coffee.